Now we will discuss the food preservation methods, the way in which we can preserve our food so that the shelf life can be increased and the incidence of disease or foodborne disease it can be reduced. So if we talk about the principle of food preservation, there are different ways by which food can be preserved. For example, number one is inactivation. By inactivation, I mean we need to look at the spoilage factors of food. For example, pathogens or growth of microorganisms. So if we can inactivate these potential agents that can deteriorate our food, or if we can inactivate certain enzymes or hormones within the food that leads to deterioration of food, we can achieve this goal. The second step or the second approach is inhibition. We inhibit the growth of pathogens within food, or we inhibit the action of certain enzymes that lead to deterioration of food by different means. It might be heat or maybe some chemical methods. We can inhibit these agents that can deteriorate food. And the third strategy is basically avoiding recontamination. So once we have a food that has been processed in a way that we have inactivated the agents to spoil our food, or we have inhibited these agents to work on the food to actually spoil it, the third stage is to avoid recontamination of food. For example, if we process a food in a very suitable way, we can destroy the pathogens, we can inactivate enzymes, and then we leave it unattended. So there are chances that this food would be recontaminated with different pathogens or maybe the chemical compounds that can then lead to the deterioration of food. Very early methods of preservation, because human beings have been involved in preserving and they have been trying to preserve their food since very old ages. For example, the very primitive form of preserving foods, when there was no technology available, they were pickling. This is the very primitive method in which you can make pickles of your food, so it would change the pH of food and the food would not be deteriorated, its shelf life would be increased. We can add salt to food, for example, salting meat or adding higher concentration of salt to any food would extend the shelf life of that food. Sugars, higher amount of sugar in any food would make it stand for a longer time. Shelf life would be higher. For example, all the jams and the related product in which higher sugar concentration actually stops the growth of microorganisms and the food can be stored for a longer time. Another way, we can store food in alcohol or any other solvent, but mostly alcohol is used where the food can be preserved within alcohol for a very long time. Another approach that has been used by humankind is to use the temperature factor, for example, the high temperature factor. But because previously the technology was not available, so most of the time food was dehydrated by solar heat. So food can be dried. For example, your fruits and vegetables can be dried, your meat can be dried under the sun. So that has been a technique used primitively, and similarly ice block has been used in areas where ice was available, so food can be stored in ice blocks as well. But we have seen this increase in technology and advancement in technology since the 19th century. After the development of canning, when the food was canned for the very first time, and then human being got to know that we can store our food for a very long time, for many years, if we can process them and fill them in cans and then heat the food at a very high temperature. We kill all the pathogens and we avoid the entrance of pathogens back into food. The food can be stored for a longer time. And afterwards, then we have seen many more revolutions in technologies, in different approaches to actually preserve the food for a very long time. Um, if you look at this history, refrigerators, they became common in 1950s only. So before that, we had no other methods. But after having refrigerators in our homes, then it makes it much more easier to store your food for a longer time. Then freezers get into the market in 1970, so that make the freezing of food possible. And then technologies came in that involve the freezing of food for a very long shelf life extension. 1980s saw the emergence of these microwaves, so we had domestic microwaves. So afterwards, these technologies have been used industrially as well as domestically for preserving food. So afterwards, then we had this revolution in the frozen food industry as well as ready food industry, because we had no the technology and the resources to process the food and then preserve it under freezer or refrigerators or using microwaves. So that has seen actually a major change in the development of food preservation technologies. If we look at the new technologies afterward, there were much more advancement. Every day we can see different approaches to preserve food for a very long time, whether we use some physical concepts, for example, sounds or waves, or whether we look at the heating mechanisms, or whether we look at the application of different kind of pressures in food. They all have led to the formation or the development of new kinds of food which are called as minimally processed food, because this with the addition of lot of preservative and harsh treatment for preservation of food, the human beings now realize that the ideal foods are the ones which are not heavily processed, rather they are minimally processed. We don't give any harsh treatment to our food like very high temperature that might affect the nutritive value of food. So that's why now the major development is to preserve food in a way that they are minimally processed, like we don't give them very harsh treatment to preserve that food, and we don't add too many chemicals. The foods are actually they are not the more green in nature. They don't have many of the additives or harmful chemicals added to food in order to preserve it. So in that connection, we can talk about some of the technologies. For example, modified atmosphere packaging technology is the one technology that uses the minimally processed food concept, and the most of the salads or fruit products are actually stored in boxes or in polythene bags, where we can maintain the concentration of different gases within that packaging material, or it can be within stores as well. So food can be stored under condition in which the atmospheric gas concentration is controlled, and that leads to a higher shelf life and the variety of food products that can get into the market due to this technology. Similarly, we have other new packaging technologies using more biodegradable resources, which are actually healthy for they are good for environment. They don't put much more pressure and burden on the environment. Then we have now the latest technology called as nanotechnology. We have used so many nanotechnology applications. For example, the silver nanoparticles, they are very much antibacterial. So we can develop kind of material for such as kitchen tool, tablewares, surfaces, plastic food, storage containers, plastic wraps that do have these nanoparticles. And because these are all antimicrobial, so they can preserve the food for a very longer time. And even these nanomaterials not getting into food, rather they the surfaces are sanitized by these nanoparticles. Encapsulation is another technology where we actually encapsulate the food material, whether it's in the gaseous form or the liquid form or solid form. We can encapsulate the food within the rigid structures called as capsules. They may be in the nano range or micrometer range. They're very small capsules. They can preserve food for a longer time because the effect of environment can be reduced. Another technology is high pressure processing technology, in which we do not give high heat temperature. We do not add any other chemicals. We only apply high pressure, especially through water, to the food, and that high pressure can actually inactivate many enzymes. It can destroy many of the pathogens, and this is a very friendly technique. This is a very advanced and new technique that is having a lot of application in food industry now, where we can process the food through a nice technology that only applies high pressure, and the food can have higher shelf life, good nutritional profile, and good color and flavor profile is also retained. So this is in generic what are different techniques for preservation of food.